Now on to the final session of the program, and I'm delighted to invite our final speaker, Dr. Edward Chang. Dr. Chang is the Joan and Sanford Weill Chair at the Gene Robertson Distinguished Professor of Neurological Surgery at the University of California, San Francisco. His clinical expertise is in surgical therapies for epilepsy, pain, and brain tumors, specializing in advanced neuro-physiological brain mapping methods and motor mapping in order to safely perform neurosurgical procedures in eloquent areas of the brain. His research focuses on the discovery of cortical mechanisms of high-order neurological function in humans. Dr. Chang's laboratory has demonstrated the detailed functional organization of the human speech cortex and has translated these discoveries towards the development of speech neuroprosthetic device to restore communication for people living with paralysis. Dr. Chang, we're delighted to have you with us here today at Wired Health Tech. Over to you.
Hi, everyone. It's great to be here. I'm really going to spend this time talking about a breakthrough that we've been able to make in our clinical trial and research in trying to understand how the brain processes one of the most unique and defining behaviors, that is the ability to speak. I'm a professor and chair of neurosurgery at University of California, San Francisco. And one of the areas that we have focused on for the last decade is trying to understand the brain circuitry that allows us with this wonderful gift for communication. It's a hallmark of our species. Everyone knows that. And the way that it basically works is that our vocal tract, consisting of the larynx and the vocal apparatus, including the tongue, the teeth, the jaw, the lips, all of that is moved very precisely to create consonants, vowels, and words. It's an extremely complex process. It's one of the most complex motor skills that we do, even though all of us do it without thinking too much about it. It requires a coordination across 100 muscles, and it's very fast. It communicates 120 to 200 words per minute for the average speaker. So this is a really extraordinary ability that we have as human beings. And also at the same time, very poorly understood. Again, we, for the past decade, have spent doing in-depth analyses, trying to understand how the brain controls these muscles in the vocal tract. They're very different than the kind of muscles that occur in the skeletal muscles of our limbs and arms and legs, for example. The lips work as a sphincter. The tongue is what we call a hydrostat. It has very different and complex kind of dynamics and are controlled by brain activity. In my lab, we study how this works using some of the highest resolution methods available for human neuroscience called electrocorticography. This involves using millisecond and millimeter resolution recordings directly from the brain as part of neurosurgical procedures to help localize where seizures come from. And oftentimes this involves putting electrodes directly on the brain. Each one of these dots here that you see superimposed on the brain actually corresponds to a single electrode. And this movie that you'll see here displays the activity of brain activity that occurs when you speak a given sentence. What you're going to see is a code of activity, a spatial temporal code, that's not just a blur, but in fact a very precise one.
Shipbuilding is a most fascinating process.
So what we've done is to look at the activity at each one of these individual sites and dissect them one by one to understand how each one of these locations in the particular brain corresponds to different movements in the vocal tract. And over the years, we've been able to discover multiple aspects of how the things like the larynx are encoded, how the different parts of the lips and the jaw are coordinated to give movement, and more. It's a very complex interaction. About 3 years ago, we made the discovery that we could essentially understand the neural code for every consonant and vowel in English. And then it's that point that my team decided that we were going to try to translate this knowledge towards the application towards people who are paralyzed, to help people who are paralyzed and cannot communicate, to help restore them in terms of words and sentences. Many of you have heard of these kind of conditions such as brainstem stroke, ALS, cerebral palsy. These are devastating conditions. And in addition to the paralysis of movement, the paralysis of communication is very, very, very challenging, and results in loss of autonomy for a lot of our patients. The most extreme form is a condition called locked-in syndrome, where essentially you have intact cognition, but paralysis of all voluntary movement. Next slide, please. I like this particular quote from Stephen Hawking where he writes, "Although I cannot move and I have to speak through a computer in my mind, I am free." This suggests that there's this huge disconnect in some of these syndromes between what someone actually wants to say versus the inability to speak from paralysis. Next slide. So we created this plot to basically describe the different communication rates for various forms of communication. On the one side, you can see handwriting Morse code around 10 to 20 words per minute, texting around 40, and typing around 40 there. Next slide. But speech is in a category of its own. You can basically see that speech is usually on the order of about 100 to 160 words per minute. And that's very unique. It's an order of magnitude more than what is capable with any other methods. Next slide. Right there. Next slide. So about 2 years ago, we endeavored to essentially try a project where we could essentially synthesize synthetic speech from brain activity alone. And we did this in our epilepsy patients, again, who are normally speaking. We did this as a proof of principle to demonstrate what is possible. And the way we did this was to build a recurrent neural network kind of machine learning artificial intelligence algorithm. Next slide. The way that it works is it translates brain activity into the movements, simulated movements of the vocal tract. And from those movements, we generate synthesized audio speech. Next slide. This shows you the spectrogram of what the patients said originally into the microphone. These are spectrograms on the top, frequency as a function of time, for 2 given sentences. And that's what our comparison point is. And below, you can see what was actually decoded from the brain activity when people spoke. It's dramatically similar to the original energy contours and the original spectrogram, but you can see a lot of the fine detail is missing, and the intelligibility of this continues to improve today. But this was really the first time that we have been able to achieve intelligible speech from doing this kind of decoding directly from the brain activity. Next slide. So in this video, you're basically going to see how the algorithm works in a demonstration. The brain activity is going to be played on the brain. You'll see the decoded simulation movements of the vocal tract on the right. And then after that, you will hear the speech that is synthesized from those decoded movements. After you hear what is decoded from the brain activity, you will hear what the person said originally, the original sentence that they uttered. Next.
The proof that you are seeking is not available in books. The proof that you are seeking is not available in books. The proof that you are seeking is not available in books. Shipbuilding is the most fascinating process. Shipbuilding is a most fascinating process. Shipbuilding is the most fascinating process.
So that's just an example of some of the synthesize words and sentences from brain activity alone compared to what the person originally said. Again, it was far from where we want to go with this, but it was really the first proof of principle that this is possible. So what we decided to do about 2 years ago is that we created a clinical trial, and we published the results of that trial in the New England Journal of Medicine in this article here, neuroprosthesis for decoding speech in a paralyzed person with anarthria, which means that we moved this to actual clinical trial in someone who's paralyzed. Anarthria is a condition that means the person has lost the ability to create intelligible speech. Meet Pancho. He's a 35-year-old man that we met, again, just 2 years ago. And about 15 years ago, he was in a car accident and woke up from that car accident completely paralyzed as a result of a brainstem stroke that left him paralyzed in the arms and legs. In addition, the loss of the ability to create intelligible speech. He can move his neck in his head, and he uses that actually to communicate. He can produce limited vocalizations like grunts and moans that you hear. So instead, he uses a stick that's connected to his and attached to his baseball cap in order to type letters out one by one, which is very, very slow, about 5 words per minute. We were really fortunate to have him join our trial. He was the first person in the world that has been able to communicate in full words through a computer directly coupled to his brain. This is the basic schematic of how this works. He sees a question that someone from our research team types onto a screen, and on his brain, in his inside of his skull, is implanted a 128-channel electrode array that covers the part of the brain that we've been studying so intensely for the last decade, that controls the vocal tract. That is, during our research sessions, is connected to a head stage that actually translates the analog signal into a digital signal, which is then read through a computer algorithm that translates those signals into words. It first detects when he is trying to speak. That's what we call speech detection, and you'll see some blinking dots on the screen when that happens. The second step after that is word classification, where basically it analyzes during those speech detection events what word is he trying to say, and it doesn't just keep track of the top ranked word, but it keeps track of every single word probability, the first, the second, the third, and fourth, and so on ranked probability of words using a neural network decoding algorithm. And the last part is something familiar to many of you, which is called a language model. Basically, this is a statistical model of the sequences of word in English that allows us to do things like autocorrection and improving the speed of the decoder. And then finally, it's displayed back on the screen. So this is basically what it looks like up close in real life. You can see that pedestal. He's lived with this for the last 2 years. We're working on a new prototype that is going to be fully implantable without having to use this percutaneous system. But for now, this is what we wanted to start with, and was working well for this clinical trial. These are the first 50 words that he was trained on, and basically shows that there are very, very accurate decoding of individual words between what was actually said and what was predicted. But there are some confusion around areas where the words had similar pronunciations. So the last thing I'll show you here is just a video demonstration. You can see where the connector is implanted, the conversational prompt, and also what is actually decoded from his brain activity. In this last example, you're going to see a situation where the top decoded word was not correct. But again, because the algorithm keeps track of the second, third, fourth rankings, it can actually use that information over time to correct the sentence and make it correct the word choices to make it grammatical. And that's what you see there. It's updating using those probabilities in the language model to correct the sentence. And of course, we were absolutely thrilled to see this. We started with a 50-word vocabulary, and we're rapidly expanding what we can do as part of this trial to 1,000 words. So I wanted to just conclude with the idea that the realm of what we call speech neuroprosthetics is evolving very quickly, and um, we're starting at sort of the baby steps of the first couple of words, but now expanding to a very, very large vocabulary in the next phases. Next slide. Next slide. And want to thank the wonderful team that has been involved. These are our wonderful postdoctoral fellows and graduate students who work with me very closely to engineer this new kind of therapy for people who are paralyzed and have lost the ability to speak. Thank you again.
Dr. Chang, thank you so much for the presentation. Remarkable piece of work. I just wonder, when you first started working with Pancho, did you know if his brain even had retained the mechanisms for speech?
Greg, that's a wonderful question. I think that was one of the biggest challenges we had going into this. We just didn't know, and this is why this was part of a clinical trial, first in man, quote unquote, type of study. After 15 years of not speaking, it was completely unclear whether the brain still had the substrate and ability and function to carry out speech, and apparently it does. I'm not saying it's the same, but certainly has the capacity, and I think it gets better with this as it goes on with time.
As you can imagine, we've got a lot of questions coming in from the audience, but I've just got one other question, if that's okay. What can you do in order to sort of to improve the decoding algorithm? Is this just a question of more and more data basically being collected?
That's part of it, and that always helps, and that's not necessarily easy, but brute force way of doing it. We're really thinking about how to do more intelligent algorithms, things that what we call biomimetic, so that you don't have to rely so much on the training data. How much can we transfer, what we call transfer learning, from other people who are involved in the project? How much can we learn from what we know about how human speech works into these algorithms, so it doesn't require so much data to make it accurate? It's a great question.
So there's so many questions coming in. I'm just going to pick a couple here, Dr. Chang. So an interesting question. I mean, I know you haven't got a very big sample size clearly, but one question is wondering if you think that maybe a teenager would have a different neural voice, as it were, to someone who is older, or do human beings all basically have the sort of same kind of like brain patterns? Would we have the same kind of neural voice, if that makes sense?
Yeah, well, I think the answer is actually a little bit of yes and no. It's yes in the sense that we all use the same apparatus, the same vocal tract, the same larynx, tongue, jaw, but we use them in very different ways, both as we age, but more importantly, across different languages and accents. So basically, yes, the core substrate of speaking is through the same vocal tract and the same neural code, but there is huge variation when you look individual to individual, and that's why this is never going to be something that's going to be like fully plug and play. These will always have to be tailored and customized to the patient's own preferences and speaking style.
And does the kind of, I guess the hope at some point is that potentially we may, at some point in the future, and I know it's not near, but be able to achieve conversational almost situations, almost real time. Is that I assume that's the ultimate aim of the research?
Absolutely. Yeah. Our main aim is really trying to restore social communication, the ability to actually carry on a conversation with a loved one or other people That's a huge goal for our team right now.
Well, it's a fascinating piece of work, and here at Wired Health, we're really going to be keeping a close eye on what's happening at your lab. Thank you so much for presenting today, and yeah, we're super excited to hear your news. So thank you for your presentation.
Absolutely, thank you.